Good morning. Thank you so much for joining our candid coffee conversations here at Forge Breast Cancer Survivor Center. We're so excited. We have Kristi Smith with us today, and she is actually going to be talking about something that we feel is a really big, kind of unspoken topic, right? It's just kind of something that people deal with on their own, privacy, and try to find ways to navigate. And we wanted to really talk about some things that can kind of help people navigate these types of situations better when you're given a serious diagnosis in the workplace. So, Kristi, if you could please give us an introduction about yourself and the work that you do.
Sure. And thank you so much for having me today. I'm thrilled to be here and to be able to participate with such a great organization. My name is Kristi Smith, and I work in human resources. I've been in human resources for over 25 years. Sometimes that's a little hard to say, but I really enjoy the work and that I get to do, especially connecting and being able to support employees just in their day-to-day experiences at work, and certainly during all of the life events that happen for each and every one of us. I currently work at Protective Life Insurance Company, so I serve in the role of Vice President of Employee Relations. So I have a lot of opportunity to engage with our employees. And my background, I have a master's in human resources. So like I said, I've been working in the field a number of years and have a little bit of educational background that aligns to that. I really view my role kind of as a dual purpose. So I have the opportunity to really serve as an advocate for our employees when they need one. But then I also serve in this role where I provide guidance for our leaders when they need guidance as well. So I see myself as kind of that person that wears two hats based on kind of what the needs are and can help facilitate both our employees and our leaders based on the different situations.
Thank you so much for, taking the time out to have this conversation with us. And it sounds like you are the expert to talk about these things. So one question that I want to kind of jump into is when a person is diagnosed with, any serious illness, specifically breast cancer, of course, but any serious illness, when is the time that a person should talk to management about it, or when should they talk to HR if they're not comfortable talking to their manager? When's the right time to start having those conversations?
Yeah, I really think it's a personal decision for people, and there's not necessarily anything that's going to say it has to happen at this specific time. Um,
Mhm.
but I always encourage employees to begin talking with their employer because they can explore what resources are available to them. And sometimes that's helpful to explore those even before you may necessarily know exactly what resources you need. So the sooner you have awareness of a serious medical condition, then I think the better it helps you begin to understand what your particular company offers in terms of resources. You can do that a number of ways. So you can do that by reaching out to HR. That may be the place that you want to start. And a lot of times, I think that really is driven by the relationships that people have with their particular managers. So they may feel comfortable to start with their manager, and that's perfectly fine. But they may feel more comfortable to reach out to human resources and explore what resources are available to them. And also, human resources can help you think through the conversation if you do want to have a conversation with your manager. So they can be a resource in that way, right? To help you think about how you want to talk with your manager, if you want to talk with your manager, what you want to say. Um, so I think you can see them in more than just a place to help understand what benefits or leave or potential accommodation options might be available to you, but I think they can also be a resource in terms of planning and thinking about that conversation. There are a couple of things that they may ask you just to kind of help people anticipate that. So they may ask you if you anticipate needing a leave. And the reality of that is you may or may not know yet. And it's perfectly fine to say that.
Mhm.
Sometimes based on where you are within your diagnosis or your medical treatment, you may not have a full picture of what your needs are, and that's perfectly fine. I think it's just important that you begin to explore what resources are available to you when and if you need them so that you know how to access them when and if that time comes, instead of trying to learn about them in the moment when you're needing them. Sometimes that can be a bit overwhelming to have to do those things at the same time. Other resources that HR may talk to you about is the need for an accommodation. They may talk to you about support through an employee assistance program. Most commonly, people call that EAP. So there are a number of ways that that they can help you, as well as kind of identifying your medical benefits and any sort of income replacement opportunities. There's a variety of resources that they offer, most companies offer, but having that conversation is kind of what I find the initial way to start to begin to explore those two.
Thank you so much. And I know that we're going to get more into detail, but something that kind of came to mind when you were talking about the relationship piece of things, right? Because not everybody gets to work with people that they get along or mesh very well with, and that's just life. But there's also just a privacy component to, like, I have this thing going on and I'm not that close with my supervisor. I don't feel comfortable sharing my medical information with my team, but I do need some assistance, but I do need some protections. How much privacy does a person have, or what right to privacy do they have in a situation like this? Even if they say, "Hey, I'm not going to take it to my manager, but I want to take it to HR. I want them to help me, but there's only so much that I want them to know." How does that work?
Certainly. I think that's a great question. And that's probably one of the most common questions I get from our own employees, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Do I have to share this with my coworkers? Do I have to tell my manager? Do I have to tell you, when they're talking with me in terms of HR? And the answer is no, you're not required to share your diagnosis. You can share as much or as little as you like. That's your choice. There are a few things that may come into play. So if you have a need for a leave and you qualify for FMLA, you are going to be asked to work with your medical provider to complete some paperwork that just certifies the need for the leave. And in that situation, you will be asked to disclose some medical information through your medical provider. You can talk with them about how much you want them to share. Typically, you will have to share a diagnosis, but you can also talk with HR about who actually sees that. I know from my organization specifically, I can give an example of that's not something that even I would see. That's strictly the company that helps us manage leave is who would actually see that information. So it's very limited, but it's okay for you to ask those questions and be aware of that so that you can make those informed decisions. And you may start in a place where you're less comfortable and your comfort may grow over time. And hopefully those relationships grow over time from a supportive relationship. So know that it's not a kind of one and done kind of thing, but also I don't want anyone to walk away thinking they have to kind of share all the details. That's not a requirement. But I hope that each of you have good working relationships or can find good working relationships, because having a trusted, supportive partner going through any serious medical condition, I think, is an important part of that experience. So that may or may not be at work, but in the same regard, I know we spend a lot of time at work, and at least in my experience, I think of some of my work colleagues like family because I spend a lot of time with them. I have trusted relationships with them. So
Thank you so much. That's something I've always wondered, how much information you have to disclose. Because part of you might feel like you have to tell it all, to so they can understand and validate that, hey, do you feel like this is a big enough thing that I need X, Y, Z? But basically, that's not the case. You have things going on because you have a right to protect your medical privacy. And so I think that knowing that and going into it might be helpful, especially for those people who are very private. Some people, they might not be that I just don't want you to know what it is that I have going on. And things like that.
Yeah. And we see that within teams. I see that frequently, that there are some people who are by nature more open. That's kind of their personality. That's how they approach life. It's how they approach any sort of serious medical situation, and so they share very openly, and that's perfectly fine. And then there are just as many people who are more private, prefer not to share, or share on a limited basis, and that's fine too. There's no real kind of um when I say right or wrong to that, right? It's got to be your comfort level, definitely. um, I find that sometimes I have an employee's colleagues that'll come to me and say, I'm concerned. I think there's something going on. Can you help facilitate a conversation with us? And we're certainly happy to do that. But the reality of that is, at the end of the day, it's the employee's on choice. It's a personal decision about who you want to share information with and what you want to share. It's okay to just say, I'm going through something right now and I don't want to talk about it. I mean, that's perfectly fine to say too, right? But I do know that we develop close relationships with people that we work with too. And so that doesn't change just because there is some serious situation going on outside of your life. A lot of times they care and want to support you too. Doesn't mean you have to give them all the details, but know that sometimes that care extends beyond just the work environment too.
Thank you. So say we've passed this part of the process, I've gotten my diagnosis, I know that I'm going to have a certain kind of treatment that will require me to be off sometime, or I just want to make sure that if I am off, my job isn't at risk. What are some protections that are in place for people who are diagnosed with a serious illness, or just have something going on that they need to take off work? And what if you're a caregiver? What are some protections that could be in place, or conversations that can be had if that is the situation?
Sure. I have a little checklist that pops up in my mind when people come to me and say, "Hey, I've just found out some information and I don't know what my next steps are. I don't quite know this journey that I'm fixing to begin or have begun. But I know I'm going to need some help. So help me think about what those things are." And the first one, people are probably at least somewhat familiar with the name, and that's what we commonly call FMLA, or the Family Medical Leave Act. There is some eligibility to it, and certainly the easiest way to do that is to reach out to your human resources department, and they can help you understand if you meet the criteria. FMLA provides protection for your own serious medical condition, or if you are the caregiver for a child, a spouse, or a parent who has a serious medical condition. So you're spot on. It can be for yourself. It can be for the care of those particular family members. You have to have worked with it has to be a covered employer. You have to have worked there for 12 months. Or at least 1,250 hours of service. It gets a little technical in terms of what that criteria is. That's why I generally tell people just to reach out to HR, and they can help you determine if you meet the eligibility requirements for FMLA, which is probably the easiest instead of trying to remember all those technical details. But essentially, it provides you up to 12 work weeks within a 12-month period for you to take leave. And that can look like several different things. It can be a continuous leave where you have a start and a stop and you're off for a continuous period of time within that 12-week period. It can be intermittent. So when I think about particularly people who may have a breast cancer diagnosis, you may or may not need continuous leave. So you may need what we call intermittent leave, and intermittent is where you take it just like it says, intermittently, right? So you may have a need to be off for treatment and some recovery period, and then you can come back to work for a few weeks, and then perhaps you need to be off again for a treatment and a recovery period. So you can do that on an intermittent basis. And through that, your medical provider would help you put together the documentation for that, describing kind of what the anticipated need is related to your intermittent need. But you still get the equivalent of the same amount of time. So you still have the equivalent of what 12 work weeks in a 12-month period would look like. So the time component doesn't change. How you take it is really the component that changes. You can also start out in one type of leave and move to another. So you may start out in an intermittent leave and then determine that you need a continuous leave. So you can switch those. You still get the same 12 weeks, if that makes sense. You don't have two, I call them buckets that you're working from. But those don't have to be just the same. And that kind of, in my mind, speaks to sometimes there is just the unanticipated nature of a medical condition. We may not always be able to anticipate exactly what that experience will be like. So there is some flexibility there as well. But what FMLA provides you is job protection. So you have to be returned once you complete FMLA. You have to be returned back to a job, the same job or an equivalent job, meaning like pay and benefits and terms and conditions of employment have to be similar. But it also provides you protection for group health insurance. So there's a continuation of your health insurance while you're on FMLA as well. The one thing that I always remind people is that FMLA is an unpaid leave. So it doesn't have a protection for pay. It has a protection for your job. But often companies will offer what I think of as income replacement type benefits that go along with a leave. Those may be things like a short-term disability plan or sick leave or sick pay benefits. So that's where I think it's important that you begin to explore your resources with HR, because they can help you identify specifically what your particular company offers and how to access those pieces too. So that can become important. One other thing I'll just mention briefly, because I don't know exactly where all of our audience is from, but based on where you live and work, states have different leave laws too. So when we talk about FMLA, we're talking about a federal law, but many states have additional state leave laws that may offer additional protections, or in some cases, additional time beyond that 12 weeks of FMLA. So it's important that you explore that piece as well based on where you live too.
Are there any differences in Alabama, or is it just stick kind of to the state?
Yeah, Alabama follows the federal law, so we follow FMLA, but I just always feel the need to remind people make sure you're asking those questions, because there may or may not be a benefit out there for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm learning so much, just like in general, about the workplace and how to have these types of conversations and services. Because I mean, we sign our contract, when we're hired somewhere, but we don't always read through it to understand it and what it could mean for us should we ever need it. So I think this is a really great resource overall to kind of just be kind of talking about and trying to learn more about. What are some other resources? I know you mentioned the EPA. I hope I'm not jumbling that.
Yeah.
EAP. I had the letters wrong.
Yep, you got it. We have a lot of acronyms in the world of human resources. I always tell people we've got our alphabet down. But yeah, there's two other things that come to mind for me, EAP being one of them, and then accommodations or medical accommodations under the ADA. So I'd like to share just a little bit about both.
Please.
EAP is an employee assistance program, and that's something some companies provide. That's not necessarily a requirement of a company. There's not a legal protection there, so to speak, but it is a support mechanism that a lot of companies take advantage of. And it is exactly what it's described. So typically a company will partner with an organization that will provide supportive services. So those may be things that look like helping you find a therapist if you need some sort of mental health support. Some companies even offer free visits to a therapist, which may be helpful as you're working through a medical diagnosis. There's often resources that may help you if you're having any sort of financial needs, or just help you from thinking through what the impact of that might be. And sometimes those resources can expand to your family members. So it's something that I always encourage employees to take advantage of if it's available. The company typically is paying for a certain percentage of the amount of the benefit on your behalf. So it's available to you. And just like you said, sometimes you work for a company and don't understand all the nuances or all those resources available. So be sure and ask if your organization has an employee assistance program or an EAP program. And then the other piece that comes to mind for me does offer some legal protections for employees, and that's the Americans with Disabilities Act, otherwise known as ADA. And you may or may not think about that in this case, but it really is talking about any situation where there may be a disability involved, and that can be temporarily or permanently. And it's really defined as either a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity. And when you think about major life activities, that can be things like walking, talking, but it can also be breathing or thinking or concentrating or things that may be a little bit more applicable to the work environment. And so employers are required to engage with their employees and offer some sort of reasonable accommodation that allows them to be able to properly function in their job. Those may be things like if you don't qualify for FMLA, you may need a leave. So a shorter term leave may look like a medical accommodation in some situations. I also think of like schedule accommodations. You may need to have a reduced work schedule for a period of time based on what your medical needs are. You may need to have a work location accommodation where perhaps you work in a different location for a period of time that allows you to function your job, but also manage your medical care. It can also be things like different types of work equipment. Perhaps you need a different type of chair to better function in your job while you're seeking medical treatment. So this is another space where it's important that you reach out to HR and talk to them about the fact that you may need a medical accommodation, what that looks like in order to request one. Again, more than likely, they're going to ask you to work with your medical provider and provide some documentation around that. But I think it's a great way for you to just explore the options that are available to you. And also, it's a great way for you to find a way to continue to work while you're dealing with your medical diagnosis. If you don't have the need to be away from work full time, sometimes an accommodation is a way to be able to manage or at least satisfy both. So it's a space worth having a conversation about.
Mm-hmm. And I had a thought when you were talking about, just in the event that, hey, I started this job a few months ago. It's been going great. I got a diagnosis of such and such. I'm not qualified for FMLA. I didn't sign up for short-term or long-term disability at hire. What are some options for individuals like that where they're presented with something, but they don't really know what they can fall back on as far as, income or, just how does that kind of look for someone?
Yeah, a medical accommodation is what comes to mind. Essentially, I think that's what an employee would be asking for. So you don't have to request a medical accommodation. The criteria is not the same for FMLA. So you don't have to be there for a year in order to qualify for a medical accommodation, right? You can certainly request it, and the employer is required to provide some sort of reasonable accommodation for you that may not necessarily look like exactly what you ask for, but they work through an interactive process with the employee to determine what's acceptable to both the employee and the employer. Accommodations, though, are similar to FMLA in that is an unpaid space. So there's no pay requirement as a part of it. So perhaps, and what I mean by that is if you're taking a leave of absence and your employer approves that, that is typically not a paid leave of absence unless there's some sort of income replacement. And perhaps you have a PTO plan that you could use. Some of it or other benefits available to you, but it can be an unpaid leave as well. Based on the state that you live in, just to circle back to it, some of the state programs have paid leaves of absence based on where you live and work. So there's a lot of things to it, is the way to say it. It can get complex.
Mhm.
I certainly don't want to overwhelm or alarm, but this is where I think it's important that you really connect with your HR contact in your organization, because they can help you navigate all those nuances for
Mhm.
your particular situation and help you identify those resources and what those look like. And that way you're making informed decisions. Certainly taking an unpaid leave of absence is not something that people do flippantly. They really have to consider their options and make the best choices for them and their family. And so I think it's important that you try to educate yourself and be informed. So
Mhm.
that you can make the best choices that you need to in those situations too.
Yeah. And basically, I'm hearing a lot of it's very individualized. There's no
Absolutely.
blanket for it. So it depends on, where you work, what state you work in, what's your situation, what are some resources that are available via that employer as well. Some might have more and some might have less. Some might be more lenient and some may not be. And so it sounds very individualized.
I think you're spot on there. It is very individualized, and it can be nuanced at times too, if I'm honest. And so that's why I think that conversation and really trying to educate yourself early on. You don't have to be the expert in it, but understanding what resources you would qualify for, what's applicable to you, is going to be important and helpful for you as well. The other piece I'll just mention around the ADA, it's similar to the FMLA in that you can expect confidentiality. So you still don't have to share your diagnosis with your leader. Like I said, they may ask you for some supporting documentation from a medical provider, but that can be kept private and confidential as well. So similarly, the confidentiality piece remains in place.
Oh my gosh. My Zoom just randomly closed.
Oh, okay.
Like I was just sitting there listening, then it was just like your bandwidth is low and close the Zoom. So thank y'all.
Sorry.
Yeah. I think that I really appreciate that you kind of highlighted that. Like there's no blanket way to go about this, and that it can be as detailed as you want it to be, or as private as you need it to be, but within reason, right? Like you do have to have cooperation between your medical team and between your workplace so that it can all make sense and gel together, so you can take advantage of some of the resources that are available. One other thing that I wanted to kind of talk to before my Zoom quits on me again, what are some rights that people have? Like, are there any rights that people can kind of, brush up on, or read up on, that they need to know about in the workplace when they're going through these things, right? Other than just resources that are available, are there any particular things that they should be mindful of when they begin these conversations with management or with HR?
Yeah, I think we've kind of covered the rights that come to mind for me, which are really around you have the right to FMLA as long as you meet the eligibility requirements for it. You also have rights under the ADA in terms of accommodations. It's not as prescriptive as FMLA is, but you do have rights and protections under both of those particular laws. So again, you don't necessarily have to be the expert in it, but it's important that you at least ask the questions and say, what is available to me under FMLA? What is available to me under the ADA? That's where I really think human resources can be a resource for you and help you understand with your specific situation and the role that you serve in an organization, kind of understanding what resources are available to you. Um, I know it can be scary to speak up and ask questions, and people are concerned that if they speak up too much, then they'll be on the radar for something, but it really doesn't work that way. Truly, I certainly recognize the fear that can come with that, and I don't want to diminish that, but it's important that you be aware of those resources. They're there for employees to access when they have a need. And the more educated the employee is about what those resources are, the better they can utilize them. And they're truly meant to be supportive for the employee when they're in some sort of unanticipated or even unknown kind of space that I think of any sort of serious medical diagnosis would be for someone. So I just encourage people to ask questions, to find you a good resource in human resources to help you out. And certainly if you have a good working relationship with your manager, they can be a resource to you too. But I know there's a lot to it, and that can be, the unknown of that can be a little scary at times. But we really are here to help people navigate those times. And ultimately, as much as you want to return and be that healthy employee, we want you to return and be that healthy employee too, right? So we're working toward the common goal there is kind of the way I think of that too.
Well, thank you so much, Kristi. I feel like these are one of those things that we can get really in the weeds on, which is a
Absolutely.
good thing though, right? Like that's a good thing. And I know that we'll probably have other ideas where we're just like, oh, we can talk about that and we can talk specifically about that. I'm so grateful that you've taken the time to do this coffee conversation with us today. And I'm really grateful that, you're in a position in your field, and you're being a resource to people who need to make adjustments as life happens, because life happens to everyone. And you can think you're super prepared, and then life comes and you realize you're not prepared for anything. So thank you so much for just giving some tips and making people aware of some resources that are available to them, and some rights that they do have under different laws to protect themselves, to protect their employment, and to get accommodations as needed. So thank you, thank you, thank you.
Well, I appreciate it. It's been my pleasure to be able to chat with you today and just share a little bit about my knowledge. I certainly am grateful for the opportunity to help out, and hopefully some of the information will be beneficial to those that you work with and help them just find a little smoother path forward too. So grateful to be here today.